Serge Tomassian. That was a wonderful presentation.
Excellent
about
presentation.
Middle East, and I think he covers a lot. I was looking at the audience; they were overwhelmed, and also the knowledge. Because Middle East is becoming so big right now. It's not only one country that the U.S. is dealing with. It's a lot of other countries. So also the question and answer session was wonderful. So you want to elaborate on that? Maybe give us a little brief on.
Yes.
Put them all together as a summary.
Yeah, summary. Sure, Alex. You're right. It was a wide range of topics. He covered a vast area of the Middle East, from Libya. We discussed Europe, Russia's involvement, Middle East, Iran, Syria, Israel, Palestine, the Palestinians, the Trump-Kushner peace plan proposed, and so I think what his critique, his analysis, and Paul is from the Middle East originally. He's from Lebanon, and so from his perspective of what is working, what is not working as far as U.S. policies in the Middle East. And I think he focused first on Iran. Let's start with Iran. He was in favor of the agreement reached between the Obama administration and Iran. Yeah, I asked that. Was he in favor? He said yes. But he also made a very important point that it only dealt with the nuclear weapon development, and it left out some of the other issues. What are the other issues? Iran's influence in Syria and Lebanon. Yeah, and so that was left for another day. And I guess his argument was the nuclear issue was so pressing that the Obama administration, the negotiators, were willing to defer the other geopolitical issues with Iran. And I think that's the difference between the Trump administration at least one of the differences in Obama's administration. The Trump administration is looking for a more global resolution of all the issues, not just the nuclear. So, but the question came up, is pressure working on Iran? And I think the answer is probably not, in the extent that it's driving the extremists to be more extreme.
And the new generation, they really love America.
Yeah.
They are going back to
and as he said, the new generation wants their freedom. They want revolution. They want change in Iran. And the question, how do we best effectuate that? Do we do that by punishing them or working with them? Or is it both? Yes. A carrot and a stick? I don't know. But that was a good point he reached. I'm going to merge a couple questions here. We're now shifting to Iran. And Fred Amiri, who's a past chairman, I'm going to summarize what he's asking. Basically, pressure on Iran hasn't worked. In other words, it's had the opposite effect. Sanctions, in other words, has been, in fact, it's strengthened the hands of the extremists, is his position, his question. So he says, the question is, do you see a new way to deal with Iran considering our past experience? I guess what he's saying, it's been ineffective. And the question is, another question someone asks is, it's a little bit different, but it still has to do with Iran. What is Iran's end game? What do they hope to achieve? Is it the nuclear weapons? Is it the recreation of the Persian Empire? What is it the Shia domination? What is it they want at the end of the day, above and beyond their security?
They want to get to the end of the day. In other words, they want to survive. But we'll get to that. Okay. On U.S. and Iran, first of all, one might say that pressure did work. The JCPOA was the result of intense global pressure on Iran to acknowledge a secret nuclear program, to come to the negotiating table, and to make fairly serious and painful concessions on an existential weapon system that would have protected them forever. It was no small feat, and it worked because of pressure. Now the problem with the JCPOA is what it was limited to and what it was followed by. The fact of the matter is, it's true, Iran pocketed the JCPOA, abided by the JCPOA, but then doubled down on intervention in the Middle East and arming militias and all of that. So it didn't violate the JCPOA, but it did something else. It's a little bit like Israel and the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Agreement with Egypt, which was a very important thing in itself, was intended to moderate Israeli behavior and lead to talks with the Palestinians, a two-state solution, and peace with the Arab and Muslim world. Israel pocketed the peace with Egypt and tripled down on its settlement policy in the West Bank. So negotiation is a long-term thing. The U.S. goes, changes every 4 years, so it is difficult. But no, I would say Iran is not immune to pressure and is not immune to negotiation. Is it easy? No. Is it complicated? Yes. But it is possible, to my mind. The alternatives, and I would say basically that in 2021, the U.S. should attempt a serious negotiation with Iran with very tough conditions, basically that they begin behaving like a normal state, withdraw militias, stop the nuclear program, limit the ballistic missiles, all of that. Now, there's a shot that that could work. If it worked, great. Great for the Middle East and for the world and so on. Maybe not great for Iranians who have to deal with the Islamic Republic. But I don't think the U.S. should be determining what happens inside Iran. I think that's Iran business of Iranians. The alternative policies are, which are viable if negotiation doesn't succeed. One policy that hawks like is, well, okay, then continued isolation, which is like North Korea, Cuba. Keep it weak, keep it contained, keep it isolated. The strategy that Obama tried, and maybe a Democratic administration would try, would be go back to the JCPOA, try to encourage pragmatists and moderates, while keeping in mind that the Iranian public, particularly the young people, are not very supportive of this, the whole Islamic Republic line. Now we're driving them more into the hands of the regime, but that young generation wants change from their government. So that could be a potential ally in the long term. What does the Iranian regime want? It does. I mean, it's more driven by its paranoias and by its security concerns. Yes, it is born as an Islamic revolutionary jihadist republic. So yes, it has a presence in Lebanon, Hezbollah. That is all the case. But their security perspective, and I've visited Tehran a number of times, I meet with Iranian officials very frequently, they are deeply paranoid, and their paranoia from their perspective is not terribly unjustified. They look at the world and they say, well, the Islamic Revolution was born, Iraq immediately invaded Iran, the entire Arab world supported Iraq, the US supported Iraq, the Soviet Union supported Iraq, and they had to fight for their lives. So in a little bit like the Israelis, they're convinced that the whole world hates them and that they want them, So they are a weak nation. They are convinced that the U.S. wants regime change in Iran, and their mode of defense is forward, aggressive, asymmetric warfare, which means they have Hezbollah, they have militias, they have terrorist networks to keep America and Israel on their toes. So they don't, to my mind, have a long-term strategy. Yes, they dream of taking over Mecca, or they have, but they're driven by regime security, national security. That's really what drives them, and maintaining their economic monopolies, especially the Revolutionary Guards, making their money and doing their business.
One of the things I thought was very interesting when he mentioned about terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and he mentioned where you have a failed state, be it Iraq, Syria, you leave the window open. You leave them an opportunity for these terrorists to develop and to gain sympathy and support, and they have a place to have bases and so forth. And so I thought that was interesting. So strengthening states, the state, obviously we want to strengthen the good states, states that treat their people well. We can't say that about necessarily say that about Syria in terms of what Assad has done in terms of the number of people killed, but strengthening the states in the Middle East helps prevent the development of terrorist groups and their growth. So I thought that was very important.
The other thing I think he mentioned about the Saudi Arabia and versus Iran and the U.S. in the Middle East. He said Iran is not afraid of the Saudi Arabia, is the U.S. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that was, someone asked about whether or not resolving the Saudi-Iranian dispute between the regimes, would that bring peace in general to the Middle East? And his quick response was that first, Iran does not fear Saudi Arabia. It's more of Iran versus the U.S. The next question relates to Iran, but I think it's the broader issue. about the conflict between Saudi Arabia and its allies, and Iran and its allies. You touched on that. So a couple questions. One from Hassan Nouri here, who spoke to us in the past on Afghanistan. But the question is, to what extent, and I'll merge that. So here we have the conflict, the ideological conflict, the geopolitical conflict between these two nations and their allies. What impact does that have on the stability with the rest of the Middle East? You touched on that, but specifically with Syria, Iraq. In other words, if that conflict, someone says, why don't we make peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Will that solve some of the other issues?
Well, first of all, the conflict is really not between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's between Iran and the U.S. Iran is not afraid of Saudi Arabia. Iran has no reason to be actually afraid. Saudi Arabia has no capacity to really hurt Iran. Saudi Arabia is afraid of Iran, but Iran is not afraid of Saudi Arabia. Iran is mortally afraid of the United States, and hence it's very worried about America's partners and allies. It's very worried about Israel, which it sees as a proxy of the U.S., worried about Saudi Arabia as a U.S. ally. So that's why it's misleading to say, oh, it's those Saudis and Iranians at war. That's not the real dynamic. That's why if there were a deal, I don't want to call it peace, whatever, between the U.S. and Iran, if Iran's security was stabilized and assured, as it were, from external aggression, that would enable it to de-escalate and begin letting down its guard. And that then might enable a de-escalation and so on. The U.S. holds those cards, not Saudi Arabia.
And so their fear, and he says it's a fear, existential fear that Iran has, that the United States and others may threaten their actual existence. Now he emphasized that point to the point that they are the clergy, the ruling people in Iran, are actually paranoid of a regime being toppled.
True. Because Iran is really not afraid of the neighbors, but they are afraid of the like U.S. power, like Israel. He talks about a lot about Palestinian and Israeli issue. Did you want to get just overall what he?
Yeah, I think he doesn't have much hope, hold out much hope for the Trump-Kushner peace plan, because he thinks that obviously it's too one-sided, and I think he indicated he thought it was for domestic purposes. I've actually read the plan, and there are some interesting points. There's economic development. There's the opportunity for land swaps so that the Palestinians. That
was a good part of it, the economic plan. $50
billion. Now, where that money is going to come from, we don't know. But there's also some land swaps where a portion of the Negev desert goes to the Palestinians. But I think his point was that the Palestinians would not have a contiguous state. In other words, it would be divided into cantons, roads, and bridges. And whether that's subject to further negotiation, I don't know. But he didn't hold out much hope. Let's turn to Israel-Palestine. The question is, to what degree would a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine lead to peace in the Middle East? And I guess the question perhaps should be, what's the likelihood?
First of all, the likelihood is very, very low. There's no real constituency in Israel for a two-state solution. The map has been so transformed that the geography hardly allows anymore an actual two-state solution. The map that the Trump administration proposed as the deal involves annexation of all the core settlements, which was even part of previous proposals, which are near the 67 border and so on. Maybe you could say manageable. But it also includes the annexation of all fringe settlements, all of them, with no exception, that there will be no removal of not one Israeli settler or Israeli settlement. And the settlement strategy, the geography has been to create spokes of settlements such that if there were to be a settlement, there would be no contiguous West Bank territory for the Palestinians. That is the current map that the Trump administration is saying is the deal of the century. And it says, don't worry, we can build tunnels and bridges so that they can get over the settlements. The plan, the map also says that Israel will take all of the Jordan Valley, meaning this Palestinian Bantustan, effectively, which will be cut up in all of these little pieces with tunnels and I don't know what, will also have no borders with anybody. The borders, it will be within Israel. Israel will control everything that's sovereign, all the borders, all the airspace, everything. And that's what's being proposed as the Trump plan. It's a completely non-starter, and it's known by the Israelis to be. And the point of this plan, from the Israeli point of view, it's to get U.S. administration buy-in for the annexation of the settlements. And that's going to happen. The U.S. already legitimized Israel's annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. It legitimized Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem into West Jerusalem. And now it is legitimizing the annexation of the settlements. That is also what Israel wants. Israel doesn't want a two-state solution, but it wants to consolidate its gains. So those two parties got what they wanted. But it is not a peace process, and it's certainly not a pathway to a two-state solution.
Now, my question to him is, what is the alternative for the Palestinians? I mean, Camp David II offered them an opportunity when Yasser Arafat had an opportunity under the Clinton to accept the proposal that probably was more favorable. They rejected that, and here we are with perhaps a less favorable proposal. I don't know the answer, but it seems to be going worse for the Palestinians and better for the Israelis. Now, Paul made a very good point. He says the Palestinians are the losers in terms of the wars.
They have been the last 50 years.
So the question is, do they suffer some of those consequences? And I think in terms of the negotiations. So those are interesting issues. I think that at the end of the day, the status quo isn't going to stay, as Paul mentioned. If it's not a two-state, it's a one-state solution. And that's not going to be good for anyone in Israel or in Palestinians.
What is the alternative then for the Palestinians? Certainly the status quo is unacceptable. What do you see as their alternative? Is time on their side, or does it seem to be working against them?
Number of things. First of all, if you talk to Palestinians, they say the status quo is preferable to legitimizing occupation forever. That's their view. That they'd rather live under occupation than legitimize and finalize the occupation. Now that's their position. You can argue with that or not. Secondly, they say, okay, they are losers, certainly, but in the long term, it's not clear how things will turn out. Obviously, there's a demographic race between Jewish, Israelis and Arab Palestinians. For a while, the Arab Palestinian and Arab Israeli population was growing much faster. Recently, Israeli growth, particularly because of high growth rate among settlers, as well as the downturn and the dark turn in Europe, there's more Jewish inflow into Israel. So Israeli Jews feel that, no, their numbers are competing, so they're not as worried in the long term. But effectively, and as I mentioned, without a perspective of a two-state solution, it's likely that pretty soon the Palestinians will say, fine, then we're Israelis. And we want to vote, and we want equal rights, and, great country you have going here, we want to be part of it. And if you think the BDS movement is problematic, how do you deal with a population that's simply saying, we want to be part of you, but we want to enjoy our political rights? So Israel is winning, but it doesn't have a pathway for a stable, democratic Jewish future that is very clear.
In fact, it's a totally different perspective nowadays about the Middle East, because I was here at World Affairs Council a few years ago when they talk about Middle East. It was some hope, but right now, seems to me the situation is getting totally different with the Trump administration, their approach to the Middle East, and there has to be some kind of solution. There is no other way alternative. I mean, the alternative is war, of course, but we don't want that. Everybody was.
But I would say this, Alec, that a few years ago when we had different events, the Palestinian-Israeli issue was at the forefront. That seems to have now been eclipsed by Syria, by Iraq, to some extent Afghanistan, by Russian involvement, ISIS. So I don't want to say the Israeli-Palestinian issue is now on the back burner, but it doesn't seem to be at the forefront as some of the other regional tensions. Even Iran now takes priority over the Palestinian, the Iranian and Saudi rivalry in the other states that are aligned. And then Turkey was mentioned in terms of their involvement and what they're doing with regards to Syria. So I think, you know, what's happened here is there's been a deflation, at least for the time being, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and because of the other issues. And I think that perhaps that's going to change down the road. And maybe at that point the Palestinians will come to the table and something could be worked out. I certainly hope something could be worked out that allows there to be stability in that region.
There is no other way except to really negotiation and talk, because when you talk, you can do a lot of things, but you know, there are no other alternative.
Exactly.
So
there's
again,
there's enough killing in the world.
Yes, exactly.
Enough killing in the world.
But that was another wonderful program of World Affairs Council with really injection of Mr. Serge Tomassian, as usual, about the analysis and the keynote speaker. Hopefully we have more of this type of program in the future. And you mentioned something about China. I am very interested in March. I think I love to come to that one.
The next major general event is on March 25th, and the topic is China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. And our expert speaker will be Mara Harris-Bendal, who will discuss her new nonfiction book, The Scientist and the Spy, A True Story of China, the FBI, and Industrial Espionage. And so that should be an excellent event. She's a previous finalist for the Pulitzer Award. And of course, we all read earlier this month, 4 members of the Chinese military were charged for the Equifax attack. And I'm sure there's more going on than we ever hear about with China. It's just what's disclosed publicly. So that should be an excellent event. Go to our website. That's on March 25th. Premium member March 13th. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
That is another wonderful program to come to see with the China, all cybersecurity stuff.
And
that would be a wonderful program.
Yes.
So another good program of World Affairs Council. Again, I want to thank you for your
Alex.
time. And
very good.
It was
Thank
nice again
you.
meeting you.